He did not lose his wife, yet he lost the right to choose how his life would be seen. Nothing was exposed. Nothing was confessed. And still, everything began to close around him in ways he could not openly resist. In a court where silence speaks louder than truth, a single image can outweigh a hidden desire, and a calm face can quietly rewrite power itself. Tonight, you will step into a world where no one fights, yet someone always disappears. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If a person were to move quietly along the edges of a Tudor court, they would begin to notice that nothing truly belonged to the individual. Not a gesture, not a word, not even a pause in conversation. Everything existed in relation to someone else's gaze, as if each moment had already been claimed by those watching before it had fully happened. The court did not rely on silence to maintain order. It relied on attention. Eyes moved constantly, not with urgency, but with habit. A glance held for a second too long, a smile that arrived slightly late, a figure standing where they should not be. These were small things, but they did not disappear. They were stored quietly, inside memory. There was no single place where observation began or ended. It passed from one person to another without effort. A servant noticed something while pouring wine. A lady repeated it later in a softer tone. A gentleman adjusted his behavior after hearing it mentioned in passing. In this way, watching became something shared, not controlled by any one authority. What made this system effective was that it never announced itself. No one declared that they were observing. No one admitted to judging. And yet, judgment formed all the same. It gathered slowly, shaped by repetition, reinforced by agreement. By the time it became visible, it no longer needed explanation. Morality, within this space, was not an abstract belief. It was something that could be seen. It lived in public rituals, in the steady rhythm of church attendance, in the arrangement of bodies during feasts, in the order of who spoke and who remained silent. These were not empty customs. They were signals. Read carefully by those who understood their meaning. A bowed head in the right moment suggested humility. A controlled posture suggested discipline. A measured response suggested loyalty. None of these needed to be stated. They were recognized immediately, as if the entire court shared a language that required no translation. The church reinforced these patterns, but it was the court that gave them weight. Sermons spoke of virtue and sin, but daily life decided how those ideas would be seen. A person could claim to be honorable, but if their actions did not align with what others expected, the claim dissolved quickly. Words carried less authority than appearance. This created a form of pressure that did not feel like force. No one was pushed, and yet everyone adjusted. People learned to anticipate how they would be perceived. They learned to correct themselves before others needed to react. Over time, this anticipation became instinct. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a life where nothing is formally recorded, yet everything is remembered, not through devices or written accounts, but through the quiet accumulation of impressions. Each small detail, insignificant on its own, gains meaning as it joins others. Within this environment, reputation did not belong entirely to the individual. It extended outward, attaching itself to family, to household, to name. A single misstep could be absorbed, but repeated patterns could not. Once a certain image began to form, it became difficult to separate the person from what others believed them to be. This is why the figure of the wife carried such weight. She did not simply represent herself. She stood as a visible expression of the household's order. Her presence reassured others that things were as they should be. Her absence, or any deviation from expectation, invited quiet concern. It was not that she was watched more than others. It was that what she represented was larger than herself. Her conduct reflected not only personal virtue, but the stability of everything connected to her, in a place where appearance guided belief. That reflection mattered. No one needed to say that her behavior was important. It was understood. It was repeated in the way people looked at her, in the way they spoke around her, in the way they remembered her after she left the room. And through that understanding, something else began to take hold. Observation was no longer just a passive act. It became a force that shaped behavior before it could fully form. It guided choices without speaking. It corrected actions without confrontation. It did not need to be visible to be effective. It only needed to be constant. The court did not need to punish, because constant observation had already taught everyone how to behave without being told. And within that quiet system, one figure began to understand how to use this attention rather than simply endure it. Because what appeared to be obedience on the surface was slowly becoming something far more deliberate underneath. She did not need to explain her place within the court. It was already understood the moment she entered the room. People did not question why she stood where she stood, or why others adjusted themselves around her. Her presence carried a kind of quiet certainty that did not require defense. In a space where everything was observed, she offered something that others could rely on. Not excitement, not unpredictability, but consistency. Her posture remained steady. Her movements were measured. Even the smallest gesture, the way she inclined her head or placed her hands, followed a pattern that others recognized without needing to name it. This is what made her significant. She did not simply exist as an individual. She represented something larger: stability, continuity, and legitimacy. These ideas did not need to be spoken when she was present. They were implied in the way she appeared, in the way others responded to her. In the absence of anything that could be questioned, her clothing reinforced this impression in ways that seemed simple, but were never accidental. Fabrics were chosen for their restraint rather than their brilliance. Colors remained controlled, avoiding anything that might suggest excess or instability. The lines of her gown fell cleanly, without disruption, without drawing attention away from the overall impression of order. Nothing about her appearance invited interpretation. It did not provoke curiosity or doubt. Instead, it settled into the expectations of the court, confirming what others already believed to be true. In this way, her image became something that could be trusted without examination. Her gestures followed the same logic. She did not move quickly, and she did not hesitate. Each action appeared deliberate, but not forced. When she greeted others, her expression remained composed, neither overly warm nor distant. It was a balance that avoided extremes, and in avoiding them, avoided suspicion. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a person who never appears uncertain, never contradicts themselves, and never reveals more than necessary, not because they are hiding something, but because they understand that consistency creates trust more effectively than explanation. This calmness was often mistaken for passivity. It was not. It functioned as a form of control that did not require confrontation. By removing anything that could be challenged, she left others with no clear point of resistance. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to expose, nothing to correct. Around her, behavior adjusted without instruction. Conversations softened. Movements became more careful. Even those who held higher rank found themselves responding differently, not because they were compelled, but because anything else felt out of place in her presence. Over time, this effect extended beyond immediate interaction. Her composure became a reference point within the court. Others did not simply observe her, they measured themselves against her. Small deviations, once unnoticed, began to stand out when placed beside her steadiness. This is how respectability began to function as something more than personal virtue. It became a structure that shaped perception, a quiet standard that influenced how others were seen, without ever needing to be enforced directly. She did not declare authority, yet authority gathered around her. She did not correct others, yet correction happened in her presence. What appeared to be stillness was, in reality, a form of influence that moved through the court without drawing attention to itself. And because it appeared natural, it remained unquestioned. Because it remained unquestioned, it became accepted. And once accepted, it no longer needed to prove itself. Her composure did not demand recognition, yet it quietly defined what the court accepted as proper and stable. And once that standard settled into place, anything that failed to align with it began to feel increasingly exposed, because beyond that calm surface, there existed a different kind of presence, one that could not remain hidden forever. The conflict did not begin with a scandal. It began with a difference that was too small to name at first. A slight shift in attention, a delay in returning to expected places, a presence that appeared where it should not, and then disappeared before it could be questioned directly. Within the court, nothing needed to be confirmed to be noticed. People did not require evidence to begin forming conclusions. They relied on patterns, and once a pattern appeared, even faintly, it began to settle into memory. The husband did not openly abandon his role. He still appeared where he was expected. He stood beside his wife during formal occasions. He fulfilled the gestures that maintained the image of order. From a distance, nothing seemed disrupted. But distance was not how the court observed. Up close, the differences accumulated. His attention did not remain where it should. His movements carried a hesitation that had not been there before. Conversations that once felt balanced now seemed uneven, as if part of his focus was directed elsewhere, beyond the visible structure of his household. This was how private desire entered the space, not as a declaration, but as a disturbance. It did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, through inconsistency. The mistress did not stand openly within the court. She existed at its edges, in corridors, in passing glances, in moments that were not meant to be seen clearly. Her presence was not recognized in the same way as the wife's. It was not confirmed. It was suggested, and yet the suggestion was enough. Because once something could be imagined, it could also be discussed. Not directly, not with names, but through implication. A pause in conversation. A look was exchanged between two observers. A remark that seemed unrelated, but lingered longer than it should. The court did not need to expose her. It only needed to acknowledge that something existed outside the accepted order. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where nothing is ever stated openly. Yet everyone understands that something has changed, not because they were told, but because the signs have become impossible to ignore. What made this conflict dangerous was not the relationship itself. It was the contrast it created. The wife remained steady, visible, aligned with expectation. The mistress remained uncertain, hidden, dependent on moments that could not be sustained, placed side by side, even without direct comparison. The difference became clear, and the court always moved toward clarity. Rumors began as fragments, not accusations, but observations. Someone noticed a repeated absence. Someone else mentioned a familiar pattern. These details did not form a complete story at first. They did not need to. They only needed to align. Once they did, the effect spread quietly. The husband's position began to shift, not in title, but in perception. Those who once saw him as stable now observed him more carefully. His actions were no longer received without interpretation. Each movement carried the possibility of meaning. This is where private desire became a public concern, not because it was exposed, but because it could no longer remain separate from the image he was expected to maintain. His role required consistency. His actions introduced uncertainty, and in a system built on observation, uncertainty could not remain contained. Political vulnerability followed naturally. In a court where alliances depended on trust, even the suggestion of instability could be used. Rivals did not need to accuse him directly. They only needed to allow the existing perception to deepen. A single doubt, repeated often enough, became more effective than any formal charge. The mistress, in this context, was not simply a person. She became a contrast, a visible sign of imbalance. Her presence suggested indulgence, unpredictability, and a lack of control. Whether this was true or not became irrelevant. It was how she was read that mattered. And once she was read in this way, the interpretation extended to him. The most significant detail was that no one intervened directly. There were no confrontations, no formal accusations, no clear moment where the situation was addressed openly. The process remained quiet. The court did not act against him. It observed him, and through that observation, it began to redefine him. His private choices, once contained within personal space, now influenced how he was understood in public. The separation between the two is no longer held. What had been hidden became visible, not through exposure, but through contrast. The wife did not need to respond. Her steadiness remained unchanged. And because it remained unchanged, it continued to draw the eye back toward what was stable, what was acceptable, what could be trusted. Everything else began to feel less certain, less aligned, less secure, in a place where perception guided reality. That difference carried weight, and once that weight settled, it did not easily lift. Private desire did not need to be revealed, because inconsistency had already made it visible within the court. And as that visibility grew, the contrast between what was stable and what was uncertain became impossible to ignore. What remained hidden was no longer the relationship itself, but how far its consequences would begin to reach. There was no moment when conflict was declared, no raised voices, no visible confrontation, no public scene that could be pointed to as the beginning of change. From a distance, everything remained in place. The husband still appeared beside his wife. The household continued to function. The rituals of the court unfolded without interruption. And yet, something had shifted. The wife did not respond in the way others might have expected. She did not accuse. She did not withdraw. She did not attempt to expose what others had already begun to suspect. Instead, she remained exactly as she had always been. Steady, composed, aligned with every expectation placed upon her. At first, this seemed like inaction. But within the structure of the court, inaction did not mean absence. It meant control of what was allowed to be seen. Her presence became more consistent, not less. She appeared at every expected gathering, observed every ritual, and maintained every visible duty without deviation. There were no signs of distress, no visible fractures in her behavior. If anything, she seemed more precise, more aligned, more entirely within the role she represented. This precision did something subtle. It removed uncertainty from her, and once uncertainty disappeared from one side, it gathered more heavily on the other. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where one person says nothing at all, yet their consistency begins to highlight the instability of someone else, not through accusation, but through contrast, not through exposure, but through alignment. The court responded to this contrast without needing direction. People did not speak openly about the situation. They did not gather to discuss it. But their attention shifted. Conversations adjusted. Observations lingered longer than before. The same patterns that once formed quiet rumors now began to form quiet conclusions. The wife did not create these conclusions. She allowed them. Her restraint ensured that no formal scandal could take shape. There were no words that could be repeated. No accusations that could be denied. Without confrontation, there was nothing to defend against. Without conflict, there was no clear point of resolution. This absence became its own form of pressure, because the court could not respond to what was not openly declared. It turned inward. It was observed more closely. It was compared more carefully, and in that comparison, the difference between what was stable and what was uncertain became increasingly difficult to ignore. The husband did not face direct opposition. No one challenged him openly, but the space around him changed. Where there had once been ease, there was now a subtle hesitation. Where there had once been unquestioned acceptance, there was now quiet consideration. Nothing was said. Everything was understood. The wife's role within this process remained unchanged on the surface. She continued to perform exactly as she had before. But that consistency now carried a different weight. It no longer simply reassured. It began to question, not through words, through presence, each time she appeared, composed and aligned. She created a silent comparison. Each time she fulfilled her role without deviation, she reinforced what the court recognized as proper. And each time this happened, anything that fell outside that pattern became more visible. The mistress did not need to be named. She did not need to be pointed out. Her existence was felt in the difference, in the gap between what was expected and what was observed, in the space where something is no longer aligned. The most striking detail was that the wife never altered her behavior to address the situation directly. She did not need to. By maintaining perfection, she allowed imperfection to reveal itself. This is how virtue became something else, not just a quality to be admired, but a condition that others were measured against. Not just a standard, but a quiet force that shaped perception without appearing to act. It did not attack. It did not accuse. It remained still, and in that stillness, it became difficult to stand against. Virtue did not confront or expose, yet its steady presence made every inconsistency impossible to overlook. And as that contrast deepened, the court began to form its own quiet judgment without needing to be guided. Something left unspoken was already taking hold, and it would not remain without consequence for long. The rhythm of the court did not end at its doors. It continued, quietly and without interruption, into the space of the church. What had been observed in halls and corridors was carried into a setting where behavior was not only seen, but given meaning. The church did not introduce new rules. It reinforced what was already understood. Sermons did not need to name individuals. They spoke in general terms of loyalty, of restraint, of the dangers of indulgence. But those who listened did not hear them as abstract ideas. They heard them as reflections of what they had already begun to notice. The setting itself altered perception. Within the court, observation was constant but unspoken. Within the church, it felt sanctioned. To be seen was not simply to be present. It was to be aligned with something larger than personal conduct. The wife appeared as she always did, composed, measured, without deviation. She occupied her place without hesitation, her posture unchanged by circumstance. There were no visible signs of tension, no indication that anything had shifted beyond the surface of daily life. This consistency carried a different weight in that space. Here, it did not simply suggest stability, it suggested legitimacy. The church gave form to what the court implied. It placed moral language around visible behavior. Actions that might have remained ambiguous in another setting became clearer when viewed through this lens. The same composure that reassured the court now aligned with the expectations of virtue as defined by something higher. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a moment where a person's public image is not only seen but also affirmed by an institution that claims authority over right and wrong. The difference is subtle, but it changes how that image is received. The wife did not need to speak. Her presence was enough. Each appearance reinforced the idea that she occupied the correct position, not only within the household, but within a broader moral order. She did not claim this alignment. She demonstrated it, repeatedly, without variation. The effect extended beyond her. Those who observed her in this setting began to connect her image with the values being described. Loyalty, discipline, and restraint were no longer abstract qualities. They were visible, embodied, and consistently presented. The husband's position, by contrast, became more difficult to interpret. He remained present. He fulfilled the expected gestures. But presence alone was no longer sufficient. Within this environment, alignment mattered, and alignment could not be maintained through appearance alone if inconsistency had already been observed elsewhere. The church did not accuse him. It did not need to. The language spoken within its walls created a framework through which behavior could be understood. Once that framework was established, individuals were placed within it by those who listened. This is how amplification occurred. The court observed, the church interpreted, and together they created a structure where perception gained depth. Rumors that once felt uncertain now seemed more defined, not proven, not confirmed, but clarified. The possibility of deviation from moral expectation became easier to recognize when those expectations were repeated and reinforced in a setting that carried authority. The mistress did not appear in this space. Her absence became part of the interpretation. She remained outside the structure that affirmed legitimacy, and because she remained outside, her position became more fragile, not through direct rejection, but through contrast. The wife stood within alignment. The mistress existed beyond it. No words were needed to explain the difference. The most significant detail was that the wife did not alter her behavior to take advantage of this setting. She did not emphasize her presence. She did not draw attention to herself. She simply continued, as she had before, allowing repetition to strengthen perception, and repetition, over time, became conviction. What had once been observed became believed. What had once been suggested became accepted. The court and the church did not merge, but they moved in the same direction, and in doing so, they left little room for anything that could not be aligned with both. The church did not create judgment, yet it gave existing observations a deeper sense of meaning and legitimacy. And as those meanings settled, the difference between alignment and deviation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Something that remained outside this moral frame was beginning to lose its place without ever being directly challenged. Within the court, influence did not always follow rank or title. It moved along quieter paths, carried by familiarity, repeated encounters, and the slow accumulation of trust between those who had known each other long before any formal gathering took place. These connections were rarely visible at first glance, yet they shaped the way people were received, spoken of, and remembered. Women within noble households were rarely isolated from one another. Their lives intersected through marriage, kinship, and shared presence across multiple estates and courts. Over time, these intersections formed something stable, not an alliance declared openly, but a network sustained through habit and recognition. This network did not operate through instruction. No one needed to gather others or outline a plan. It existed in the way names were spoken, in the tone of approval that followed certain descriptions, and in the quiet agreement that passed between listeners who recognized the same qualities without needing them to be explained. The wife's presence moved easily within this structure. Her behavior required no adjustment to fit what others already valued. Descriptions of her composure, her steadiness, her consistency did not sound like praise constructed for effect. They aligned too closely with what had already been observed. Because of this, each repetition strengthened what came before it. A remark made in passing would reappear later in a different setting, carried by a different voice, not identical, but similar enough to reinforce the same impression. Over time, these remarks formed a continuous thread, linking one conversation to another. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a reputation that spreads without direct promotion. No single person claims responsibility for shaping it, yet it becomes widely accepted because it is repeated in slightly different forms across different spaces. What made this system effective was its lack of visibility. There were no declarations of support, no visible gestures of alignment. The network revealed itself only through consistency. The same qualities were recognized. The same tones were used. The same conclusions were reached. Even when no one appeared to be guiding the process, the wife remained within that pattern without effort. The mistress did not. This difference did not need to be explained. It appeared in the absence rather than in criticism. Invitations that did not extend. Conversations that did not include. A presence that was acknowledged briefly, if at all, and then allowed to fade from attention. This absence was not abrupt. It unfolded gradually. At first, it might have seemed unintentional. A missed greeting, a conversation redirected elsewhere, a moment where attention shifted before it could settle. But as these moments repeated, they formed something more deliberate. Silence became a form of recognition, not the kind that affirmed, but the kind that withheld. Those who interacted with the wife did so without hesitation. Their approval felt natural, as though it required no justification. Her presence fit within the network's expectations so completely that it did not disrupt its flow. The mistress, by contrast, introduced uncertainty, not through action, but through misalignment. Her presence did not fit easily into the established pattern. It required adjustment, explanation, or discretion. And within a system that relied on consistency, anything that required adjustment became more difficult to sustain. Over time, this difficulty translated into distance. The mistress remained visible, but less connected. Her presence did not carry forward into other conversations. Her name did not move through the same channels. Without repetition, her position lacked reinforcement. This is how isolation began to take form. Not through exclusion that could be pointed to, but through recognition that failed to extend beyond immediate moments. The absence of continuation created a boundary that did not need to be marked. The wife did not need to participate directly in this process. Her role remained unchanged. She continued to appear as expected, to behave as expected, to align with the qualities that the network already reinforced. And because she remained consistent, the network continued to reflect that consistency to her, strengthening her position without requiring visible effort. Over time, this reflection created a sense of stability that extended beyond her individual presence. It attached itself to her household, to her name, to everything associated with her. The more it was repeated, the more it became difficult to separate her from the qualities it described. Inside this structure, recognition circulated. Outside it, attention diminished. No announcement marked this division. No moment defined its beginning. It emerged through repetition, through alignment, through the gradual reinforcement of what fit and the quiet withdrawal from what did not. By the time the difference could be clearly observed, it had already settled into place. And once settled, it did not easily shift. Quiet alliances did not need to declare themselves. Yet their steady patterns made one presence feel supported and another increasingly unsupported. And as that support continued to circulate, distance formed without any visible act of exclusion. A presence that once moved within shared spaces was now beginning to remain there alone, without anyone needing to push it away. The gatherings did not begin with an intention that could be easily recognized. They appeared as part of the court's regular rhythm, expected and familiar. Invitations were extended in the usual way. Tables were arranged according to custom. Nothing about the preparation suggested anything beyond what had always been done. And yet, within that familiarity, there was precision. The wife did not need to alter the structure of the event. She worked within it. Every placement, every sequence, every moment of interaction followed established patterns. What changed was not the form, but the consistency with which it was maintained. Guests entered spaces that felt ordered before they had fully settled into them. Seating arrangements aligned without confusion. Conversations found their place without interruption. The movement of servants, the timing of courses, the transitions between moments, all unfolded without visible strain. This created an environment where nothing appeared out of place, and in a setting where everything aligned so closely with expectation, any deviation became more noticeable. The husband remained present, as he was expected to be. He greeted guests, participated in conversation, and fulfilled his role within the structure of the gathering. From a distance, there was no visible disruption. But distance was not how the court experienced such events. Up close, attention moved carefully. The wife's composure remained unchanged. She moved through the space without hesitation, her gestures consistent, her tone steady. She did not need to emphasize her role. It was reinforced by the structure around her. Each successful interaction, each smooth transition, confirmed her position without requiring acknowledgement. If we compare this to today, it would resemble an event where everything appears effortless. Yet every detail has been arranged in advance. Guests do not notice the structure itself. They notice only that nothing feels out of place. Within that controlled environment, the husband's behavior was not judged directly. It was observed in contrast. His presence within the gathering was expected to align with the order that surrounded him. Any hesitation, any moment of distraction, any shift in attention stood out more clearly because the rest of the space remained so stable. The wife did not draw attention to these differences. She did not need to. The structure of the event did that for her. Every successful element of the gathering reinforced what was considered proper. Every smooth interaction reminded those present of what alignment looked like. And within that context, anything that did not fully align became more visible. Even if no one spoke of it, the image of the household remained intact. Guests saw harmony. They saw continuity. They saw a marriage that functioned without disruption. This image did not require explanation. It was presented through repetition. Each gathering confirmed the last, creating a pattern that became increasingly difficult to question. The mistress did not exist within this structure. Her absence was not acknowledged, but it was felt in the completeness of what was presented. There was no space within the gathering for what could not be included without disrupting its order. In this way, exclusion did not need to be enforced. It was built into the structure itself. The most significant detail was that the wife never appeared to be using the gathering for any purpose beyond what was expected. She did not overextend her presence. She did not seek recognition. She allowed the event to function as it should. And because it functioned so well, it carried weight. Over time, these gatherings did more than maintain appearance. They reinforced it. They repeated it. They made it familiar. And once something becomes familiar, it becomes difficult to challenge. The husband did not face accusations within these spaces. He faced expectation. And expectation, when repeated often enough, can become more restrictive than any confrontation. The court did not need to intervene. It only needed to observe what was presented, and what was presented left little room for anything that could not align with it. The gatherings did not expose conflict, yet their quiet order made any inconsistency within them easier to recognize. And as that order was repeated, expectation began to settle more firmly around those who stood within it. One presence that could not fully align with that expectation was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in plain view. Her behavior did not change in response to what had been observed. It remained steady, consistent with everything the court had already come to expect. Each gesture followed the same measured rhythm. Each appearance reinforced the same image. There was no visible adjustment, no sign that anything required correction. And yet, the effect of that consistency began to shift. What had once reassured now began to reflect. Every action she performed carried a clarity that extended beyond itself. A simple greeting, offered without hesitation, revealed the absence of tension. A composed posture, held without effort, suggested control. These details did not draw attention in isolation, but repeated over time, they created a surface against which everything else could be seen more clearly. The court did not need to interpret her behavior actively. It recognized it, and in recognizing it, it began to use it as a reference. If we compare this to today, it would resemble standing beside someone who never raises their voice, never falters, never reveals uncertainty, and gradually becomes aware of one's own hesitation in contrast, not because it is pointed out, but because it becomes impossible to ignore. The husband remained within the same space. He continued to fulfill his role. He appeared where he was expected, spoke when required, and maintained the structure that had always defined his position. Nothing about his actions could be openly criticized. There was no clear failure, but the presence of a standard changed how those actions were received. His movements, once accepted without question, now carried weight. A slight delay in response, a glance that lingered elsewhere, a moment of distraction that might once have passed unnoticed. These details began to gather meaning, not through accusation. Through comparison, the wife did not need to draw attention to these differences. Her consistency did that for her. Each time, she aligned perfectly with expectation. She created a point of reflection. Each time, she moved without hesitation. She made hesitation more visible. Each time, she remained composed. She made instability easier to detect. This is how reduction began. Not through loss of status, not through removal of authority, but through perception. The husband did not shrink in position. He shrank in clarity. What had once appeared solid now seemed less certain, not because it had changed, but because something else had become more defined. Public attention did not shift abruptly. It narrowed. Where once he had been observed as part of a stable structure, he was now observed within a contrast. And within that contrast, his alignment became a question that did not need to be asked directly. The most significant detail was that no one spoke of this change openly. There were no comments, no corrections, no visible reactions that could be pointed to as evidence. The process remained quiet, contained within observation and memory. The wife did not confront. She did not accuse. She did not alter her behavior to produce a visible effect. She continued. And in continuing, she allowed the court to do the work of interpretation. Private desire, which had once remained separate from public image, began to take on a different weight. It was no longer invisible, not because it had been revealed, but because it could no longer be separated from what was being observed. The contrast created a form of pressure that did not need to be applied directly. It existed within perception. It existed within expectation. It existed within the awareness that something did not fully align. Over time, this awareness deepened. It moved beyond observation and into judgment. Not a formal judgment, not declared, but felt. The husband did not need to be accused of wrongdoing for the effect to take hold. He only needed to be seen in contrast. And once that contrast settled, it became difficult to ignore the difference between what was stable and what was not. The wife remained unchanged. The court adjusted around her, and in that adjustment, the space he occupied began to feel smaller. Not through action, through comparison. Her composure did not diminish him directly, yet it made every inconsistency within his behavior more visible. And as that visibility deepened, the court began to read his actions against a standard he could no longer fully match. Private desire. Once hidden, it was beginning to feel less like a secret and more like a burden that could not be easily carried. Clothing did not function as decoration within the court. It operated as a visible system of meaning, understood without explanation and interpreted without hesitation. A person did not simply wear fabric. They presented a statement that others read immediately, often before a single word was spoken. Colors carried weight. Muted tones suggested restraint. Darker shades implied control. Soft contrasts indicated balance. These were not rules written down, but patterns repeated often enough to become instinctive. Those who moved within the court learned to recognize them without being taught. The wife's appearance aligned with these patterns completely. Her clothing did not seek attention. It settled into the space without disruption. The fabric fell in measured lines. The colors remained contained, and every detail supported the impression of steadiness. Nothing appeared excessive. Nothing appeared uncertain. This alignment removed the need for interpretation. She did not need to be explained. She was understood. If we compare this to today, it would resemble entering a room where one person's appearance communicates clarity so completely that no one feels the need to question it. Not because it is extraordinary, but because it fits expectations without deviation. The mistress occupied a different position. Her presence did not align as easily. This difference was not always obvious at first glance. It appeared in small details. A color that drew attention more quickly than it should. A fabric that caught the light in a way that lingered. A contrast that disrupted the balance the court had come to expect. These details were not violations. They were signals. And within a system that relied on observation, signals did not remain neutral. They accumulated. At first, they might have been dismissed. A variation in taste, a difference in preference. But as they repeated, they began to form a pattern that could not be easily separated from the person who wore them. This is how visual judgment took shape, not through direct criticism, but through recognition. A glance held slightly longer than necessary. A pause in conversation as attention shifted. A subtle adjustment in tone when her name was mentioned. These reactions did not need to be explained. They were understood as part of the same language that governed the rest of the court. The wife did not need to contrast herself directly with the mistress. Her consistency created the contrast. Each time she appeared in alignment with expectation, she reinforced what the court recognized as proper. Each time this happened, anything that deviated from that alignment became easier to notice. Over time, the difference between the two figures became less about individual choice and more about meaning. The wife's clothing suggested order. The mistress's clothing suggested disruption. Whether this interpretation was fair became irrelevant. It was how the court read it that mattered. The most significant detail was that this process required no intervention. No one needed to correct, to advise, or to condemn. The visual language functioned on its own. It allowed people to form conclusions without needing to speak them aloud. It allowed judgment to exist without becoming confrontation. The husband remained within this system. He did not choose how these meanings were assigned, but he was affected by them. Each association attached itself quietly to his position. The steadiness represented by his wife reinforced the expectation placed upon him. The contrast introduced by the mistress complicated that expectation. And in a space where clarity was valued, complication carried weight. The court did not reject what it could not align. It observed it. It compared it. It allowed meaning to settle gradually. And once that meaning settled, it influenced how everything connected to it was perceived. Clothing, in this sense, did more than cover the body. It revealed alignment. It revealed deviation. It allowed the court to see without needing to ask. Clothing did not need to declare meaning, yet its quiet patterns made alignment and deviation visible to everyone who observed. And as those patterns repeated, visual differences began to carry more weight than anything spoken aloud. A contrast that once seemed minor was beginning to define how certain figures were understood within the court. Children did not exist as private joy within the court. They existed as visible confirmation. Their presence extended beyond the household, shaping how a family was understood by those who observed it from the outside. A child did not need to speak to be recognized. Position alone was enough. Where the child stood, who they stood beside, and how they were acknowledged. These details carried meaning that did not require explanation. The court read them immediately, as part of the same system that interpreted gesture, clothing, and behavior. The wife's position strengthened through this presence. She did not need to assert her role. It was reflected in the continuity the child represented. A line extended forward, visible and undeniable. Not a possibility, but a confirmation that what existed within the household would persist. This continuity carried weight. It suggested stability that could not be easily replaced. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a structure where legitimacy is not only claimed, but also embodied in something that others can see and recognize without needing to be told. The presence of a son intensified this effect. It did not introduce new meaning, but it made the existing meaning more difficult to ignore. Responsibility became more visible. Expectation became more defined. The husband's role was no longer limited to his own behavior. It extended into what he represented for what came after him. He did not need to be reminded of this directly. The presence of the child did that. Each appearance reinforced the connection between him and the structure he was expected to maintain. Each acknowledgement of the child's position reflected onto his own. The wife remained within this alignment, without deviation. Her role, already established, became further anchored by what the child represented. She did not need to emphasize this connection. It existed visibly, repeated in every setting where the family appeared together. The court did not question what it could clearly see. A complete household carried its own authority. It did not rely on argument or explanation. It existed as proof. The mistress, by contrast, did not exist within this structure. Her presence could not be extended into continuity. It remained limited to the present, without connection to what the court recognized as lasting. This limitation did not need to be stated. It was understood through absence, where the wife's position expanded through association. The mistress's position remained contained. It did not move beyond the immediate moment. It did not attach itself to anything that could be seen as stable over time. This difference created pressure, not through confrontation, but through comparison. The husband stood between these two conditions. On one side, continuity. On the other hand, limitation. He did not need to choose openly. The structure around him began to suggest the direction. Each time the child appeared, the expectation attached to him became more visible. Each time the family was observed together, the image of stability strengthened. And as that image strengthened, anything that existed outside of it became more difficult to reconcile. The court did not impose this pressure directly. It allowed it to form. Through observation, through repetition, through the quiet acknowledgement of what aligned with its expectations. The most significant detail was that no one needed to speak of responsibility. It was visible. It stood beside him. It moved with him through every public space. The child did not act as an argument. The child acted as evidence. And evidence, once seen, did not need to be repeated in words. Over time, this visibility shaped perception, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. The husband's position became increasingly tied to what he represented beyond himself. His actions were no longer interpreted only in the present. They were understood in relation to what they affected. And in a system that valued continuity, that interpretation carried weight. The wife remained aligned. The child remained visible. The structure held. Everything outside of it began to feel less secure. Children did not need to speak, yet their presence confirmed a structure the court recognized as stable and legitimate. And as that structure became more visible, the expectations surrounding it settled more firmly around those connected to it. One position that could not extend into that continuity was beginning to appear increasingly limited in comparison. She did not speak about what had been noticed. No statement was made. No accusation formed. No attempt to bring what existed in quiet observation into open language. The absence of words was not hesitation. It was a decision that aligned with everything the court already understood about how conflict should be handled when reputation was at stake. To accuse openly would have required evidence. It would have demanded a response. It would have introduced uncertainty into a structure that depended on appearing stable. She did not allow that to happen. Her silence preserved the surface. And within that preserved surface, everything else continued to move. The court did not need confirmation to begin forming conclusions. It had already begun. What remained uncertain could continue to exist as a suggestion. And suggestion, left unchallenged, often settled more deeply than direct statements ever could. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where nothing is ever said publicly. Yet everyone understands that something has shifted, not because they were told, but because no one has denied it. The wife's restraint ensured that no formal disruption could take place. There were no confrontations that others could witness, no exchanges that could be repeated, no moment that could be pointed to as the source of conflict. Without these elements, the court was left with only what it had already observed, and what it had observed continued to develop. Silence created space. Within that space, interpretation expanded. People did not wait for clarification. They filled the absence themselves. A glance remembered from a previous gathering. A pattern was noticed across several appearances. A name mentioned in a tone that suggested more than it revealed. These fragments are connected. Over time, they formed something that felt complete. The wife did not guide this process directly. She allowed it. Her behavior remained unchanged, reinforcing the image that the court had already accepted. She did not appear withdrawn. She did not signal distress. She continued to fulfill her role without deviation, ensuring that no alternative explanation could easily replace what others had begun to suspect. This consistency made her silence more effective, because it did not contradict what was being observed. It supported it. The absence of accusation prevented the situation from becoming a scandal. Without scandal, there was nothing to defend against. Without defense, there was no opportunity to deny. Everything remained contained within perception. The husband did not face confrontation. No one approached him with questions that required answers. No formal challenge interrupted his position. But the space around him shifted. Where there had once been ease, there was now a subtle awareness. Where there had once been assumption, there was now consideration. Nothing was said. Everything was read. The most significant detail was that silence did not remove pressure. It redirected it. Instead of being applied through words, it settled through observation. It gathered in the way people looked, in the way they paused, in the way they remembered. This form of pressure did not demand an immediate response. It remained. And because it remained, it deepened. The wife did not need to act against him. She only needed to remain aligned with what the court recognized as proper. Her silence protected the household from open disruption, while allowing perception to shift beneath the surface. The family's reputation remained intact. No visible fracture appeared. And yet, the meaning attached to that reputation began to change. The mistress remained unspoken. Her presence existed within suggestion, within implication, within the quiet understanding that had formed without being confirmed. She was not named, not addressed, not directly acknowledged. This absence made her position unstable. Without words, she could not be defended. Without accusation, she could not be denied. She remained within the space between. And within that space, She depended entirely on how others chose to interpret what they had seen. The court did not rush to a conclusion. It did not need to. Time, repetition, and silence were enough. The longer nothing was said, the more complete the understanding became. And once that understanding settled, it no longer required confirmation. Silence did not prevent judgment, yet it allowed perception to form without interruption or resistance. And as that perception deepened, the absence of accusation began to carry more weight than any spoken claim. That presence, never clearly named, was now being defined entirely by what others believed it to be. She did not change her expression. There was no visible shift that could be identified as a reaction. No sign of strain. No trace of resentment. No attempt to correct what others might already be thinking. Her face remained composed, as it always had been, aligned with the expectations that surrounded her position. Yet something within that stillness began to draw attention. A smile, slight and measured, appeared at the same moments it always had. During greetings, during formal exchanges, during the slow circulation of conversation within the hall. It did not linger longer than necessary. It did not invite interpretation. It followed the same rhythm as before. And yet, it was no longer received in the same way. The court did not question the smile itself. It questioned what existed around it. Because nothing else had changed. Her posture remained steady. Her voice remained even. Her presence within each setting remained consistent, neither withdrawn nor emphasized. There was no visible disruption that could explain the shift that others had begun to sense. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a moment when someone behaves exactly as expected. Yet the absence of any visible disturbance becomes the very thing that feels unusual. The smile did not conceal. It reflected not what she intended to show, but what others had already begun to notice. It became a surface upon which interpretation settled. Those who observed her did not look for signs of emotion. They looked for meaning in the lack of it. And in that lack, they began to form questions. No one asked them directly. They formed quietly. Why did she remain unchanged? Why did she not react? Why did nothing appear to disturb her? These questions did not require answers. They required only repetition. Each time she appeared, each time the same expression returned, each time the same composure was maintained. The questions grew more defined, not louder, not more visible, but more certain. The absence of visible conflict began to suggest something else. Not ignorance, not indifference, control. The court recognized this without needing to speak of it. Control, when displayed without effort. It did not demand attention. It redirected it. Those who observed her began to look elsewhere. Not at her, but at what existed in contrast to her. And in that contrast, the difference became clearer. Where she remained steady, something else appeared less so. Where she remained composed, something else seemed uncertain. No accusation had been made. No confrontation had taken place. Yet comparison had already begun. The most significant detail was that she did not participate in this comparison. She did not initiate it. She did not reinforce it. She simply remained as she had always been. And because she remained, everything else began to shift in relation to her. The smile did not act as a defense. It did not act as a denial. It acted as continuity. And continuity, within a system that depended on stability, carried its own authority. The court did not need to decide what the smile meant. It decided what it revealed, not through words, but through alignment. She aligned with expectation. She aligned with the structure. She aligned with what the court recognized as proper. Everything outside of that alignment began to feel less certain. The husband did not stand within that same clarity. No visible action placed him outside of it. Yet something about his position no longer settled as easily within the structure that surrounded him. This change was not declared. It was observed. And observation, once repeated, did not fade. The mistress remained unspoken, yet increasingly defined through contrast, not by what she did, but by what she was not. Not aligned, not stable, not reflected in the same quiet continuity. The smile, unchanged, continued to appear, and each time it appeared, it carried more weight, not because it had changed, but because everything around it had. The smile did not reveal emotion, yet it drew attention to everything that remained unspoken within the court. And as that attention settled, comparison formed without needing to be guided or explained. A question that no one voiced was beginning to shape how each presence would be understood. Nothing moved through the household without being noticed, not because anyone was watching too closely, but because the structure of the house itself allowed very little to pass unseen. Servants occupied every space between rooms, between conversations, between moments that others believed were private. They did not need to search for information. They lived within it. Every tray carried more than food. Every doorway held more than movement. Every errand passed through hands that remembered what they had seen, even if they never spoke of it directly. The wife did not instruct them openly. Loyalty did not need to be declared in words. It formed through position, through consistency, through the quiet understanding of who represented stability within the household. The servants aligned themselves accordingly. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a system where information flows constantly, but its direction is shaped not by commands, but by trust and proximity. The wife remained at the center of that alignment. She did not ask for reports. She did not gather details. She did not appear to manage anything beyond her visible responsibilities. Yet everything that moved within the house passed through a structure that reflected her position. And within that structure, information settled, not gathered, not collected, settled. A conversation overheard did not become a statement. It became awareness. A pattern noticed did not become an accusation. It became a memory. These fragments did not move outward immediately. They remained within the household, shifting quietly, finding their place within what was already understood. The servants did not spread rumors carelessly. They did not need to. Their role was not to expose, but to circulate. Information moved through tone, through emphasis, through what was repeated and what was left unspoken. A detail mentioned once might disappear. A detail mentioned twice might remain. A detail mentioned in a certain way might begin to take on meaning beyond itself. The wife did not control every detail. She did not need to. She maintained the environment in which details found their direction. Her presence defined what was acceptable to repeat, what was unnecessary to emphasize, and what should remain within quiet understanding. The servants responded to this without needing instruction. Loyalty was not demonstrated through action. It was demonstrated through restraint. The mistress existed within this flow of information, but not at its center. Her presence appeared in fragments, a name spoken in passing, a detail remembered without context, a movement noticed but not confirmed. These fragments did not gather around her in a stable form. They remained scattered, shaped by how they were repeated rather than by what they contained. This made her position uncertain, not hidden, but not fixed. The husband existed within both layers. He moved through the visible structure of the household, while also existing within the quieter circulation of information that followed him without being seen. He did not receive confrontation, but he did not move without being understood. Each action, each absence, each change in pattern became part of the awareness that surrounded him. The servants did not act as messengers. They acted as memory. And memory, once shared, did not need to be spoken loudly to become effective. The most significant detail was that nothing became explicit. There was no moment where information transformed into accusation, no point at which what was known became what was declared. Everything remained within the space of suggestion. And within that space, it gained stability, because it was not challenged, because it was not denied, because it was not brought into a form that required defense. The wife remained separate from this movement. She did not participate in it directly. She did not confirm it. She did not deny it. Her distance allowed it to continue without interruption. And because it continued, it strengthened. The household remained outwardly unchanged. Meals were served. Doors opened and closed. Voices carried through corridors as they always had. Yet beneath that consistency, information moved in a way that no longer returned to where it began. It settled into understanding. It shaped perception. And once shaped, it did not need to be repeated in full. Only suggested. Information did not need to be declared. Yet it moved steadily through the household until it formed a shared understanding. And as that understanding settled, repetition gave certain details more weight without ever making them explicit. An awareness that no one openly acknowledged was beginning to define how every action would be interpreted. Gossip did not begin as an accusation. It did not point directly, did not attach itself to a name, did not settle into a form that could be challenged or denied. It moved instead through suggestion, shaped carefully by tone rather than by content. No one spoke of him. No one needed to. The subject remained unspoken. Yet the meaning continued to circulate. Conversations within the court often appeared unrelated to any specific situation. They revolved around values that everyone recognized: family, duty, honor, and restraint. These themes were not new. They had always existed within the language of the court. But now they began to appear more frequently. And more precisely, if we compare this to today, it would resemble a conversation where no one addresses the issue directly. Yet every example, every story, every reflection seems to point toward the same unspoken center. A noblewoman might speak of loyalty during a gathering. Another might recall a family that had lost its standing due to private excess. A third might comment, quietly, on the importance of maintaining balance between desire and responsibility. None of these statements required confirmation. None of them required a response. Yet together, they formed a pattern. The wife did not participate in these conversations with the intention that could be identified. She did not guide them openly. She did not reinforce them through visible agreement. She remained within them as she always had. Measured, composed, aligned with the values being spoken of. And because she remained aligned, those values began to reflect her position more clearly. The court did not need to decide who represented virtue. It recognized it through consistency. At the same time, contrast began to emerge, not through accusation, through implication. The mistress was never named. Yet the absence of her name did not protect her from being understood as part of the contrast being formed. Each mention of stability suggested instability elsewhere. Each reference to restraint suggested the presence of excess. And over time, these suggestions began to settle. The most effective detail was that nothing could be denied. There was no statement to reject, no claim to respond to, no moment that required defense. The husband did not find himself accused. He found himself surrounded, not by people, but by expectation. The atmosphere shifted. What had once been neutral became weighted. A simple conversation carried more meaning than before. A casual remark lingered longer than expected. A moment of silence between sentences held more than absence. Everything began to point, without ever pointing directly. The court did not act with urgency. It did not seek a resolution. It allowed repetition to do the work. Each conversation added another layer. Each reminder reinforced the last. Each unspoken connection became more stable through being left unchallenged. The wife did not interrupt this process. She did not accelerate it. She remained within it, allowing it to unfold in alignment with the structure that already existed. Her role was not to create pressure. It was to remain the standard against which pressure formed. The servants carried these conversations beyond the immediate setting, not as declarations, as echoes, a phrase repeated in a different room, a reflection shared in a different tone, a story remembered and slightly adjusted in its telling. These small movements allowed the pattern to extend without ever becoming fixed. The mistress, within this atmosphere, became increasingly difficult to place, not because she was hidden, because she did not align. Her presence did not match the values being repeated. Her position did not fit within the structure being reinforced. And as that structure became more visible, her distance from it became more apparent. Without accusation, she could not respond. Without being named, she could not be defended. She existed within contrast. In contrast, once established, it did not require explanation. The husband felt this shift without being told. Nothing was said to him directly. No warning was given. Yet the space around him changed. Conversations paused differently in his presence. Certain topics lingered longer. Certain silences felt more deliberate. He did not face confrontation. He faced awareness. And awareness, once formed, did not need to declare itself to be understood. Gossip did not accuse. Yet it repeated values until they began to shape how actions were interpreted within the court. And as those values settled into expectation, contrast emerged without needing to be explained. A presence that no one directly addressed was becoming increasingly defined by what it failed to align with. His position had not changed. No title had been removed. No authority had been formally reduced. No decree had been issued to question his standing within the court. On the surface, everything remained intact, arranged exactly as it had been before. Yet the stability of that position no longer felt complete. It rested on something that could not be written into law, but could be weakened without warning. Reputation did not belong entirely to him. It existed within the structure of the household, and within that structure, it depended on what others believed they understood. The court did not separate private life from public function. It never had. A man's authority extended beyond his decisions, beyond his alliances, beyond his visible duties. It extended into the order of his household, into the behavior of those connected to him, into the image that could be observed without needing explanation. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a figure whose public role remains unchanged, yet whose credibility begins to erode through what is perceived rather than what is proven. The husband began to recognize this shift, not through confrontation, through accumulation, a pause in conversation that lingered longer than before, a glance that did not resolve itself into neutrality, a tone that suggested consideration rather than certainty. These details did not present themselves as threats. They presented themselves as awareness. And awareness, once formed, did not need to be declared in order to influence. His household, once a source of stability, now carried an element of uncertainty, not visible enough to be addressed, but present enough to be considered. The court did not question him directly. It adjusted around him. This adjustment was subtle. It did not exclude him. It did not challenge him. It simply introduced a degree of hesitation where there had once been none. And hesitation, within a structure that depended on confidence, carried weight. The wife's position remained unchanged. Her consistency reinforced the image that the court recognized as proper. She continued to appear as the embodiment of stability, of legitimacy, of alignment with expectation. This contrast did not need to be emphasized. It existed naturally, and because it existed, it began to define the difference between what was secure and what was uncertain. The husband could not ignore this difference. He did not receive accusations. He received implications. His actions, once neutral, began to carry an interpretation. His absence from certain spaces was noticed. His presence within others was measured differently. Nothing had been said, Yet everything had been placed within a context that had not existed before. Political rivals did not need to act immediately. They did not need evidence. They did not need confirmation. They needed only to observe. And observation, when shared, became a possibility. A reputation that remained unquestioned could not be used against him. But a reputation that carried even the slightest uncertainty could be approached, shaped, and eventually redirected. The court understood this. So did he. The most significant detail was that the risk did not appear suddenly. It developed gradually. It allowed him time to notice it. And within that time, he began to consider, not whether he had done anything that could be proven, but whether what could not be proven might still be believed. This distinction mattered more than any accusation, because belief did not require proof. It required alignment, and alignment was no longer entirely in his control. The mistress remained unspoken, yet increasingly present within this calculation, not as a person, as a variably. Her existence did not need to be confirmed to be considered. She represented the possibility of imbalance, of misalignment, of something that could be interpreted in a way that weakened the structure he depended on. The wife, by contrast, required no interpretation. She remained consistent, and consistency, within a system that valued stability above all else, carried authority that could not easily be replaced. The husband did not act immediately. He did not confront. He did not deny. He observed. And within that observation, he began to measure the distance between what he could maintain and what he might begin to lose. Nothing had been taken from him. Yet something had begun to shift beyond his reach. His position remained intact. Yet its stability had begun to depend on how others interpreted what could not be openly addressed. And as that interpretation quietly expanded, ambition started to weigh more heavily against what could no longer remain unnoticed. A conflict that had not yet surfaced was already beginning to determine which part of his life could be allowed to remain. Desire did not disappear. It remained present, unchanged in its intensity, unchanged in its familiarity. Existing as something that had once required no justification, it had formed quietly, without disruption, without consequence that could be measured beyond the private space in which it belonged. But its position had begun to shift, not because it had grown stronger, because everything around it had begun to change. The court no longer functioned as a space where separation could be maintained easily. Private inclination and public responsibility did not exist in parallel lines. They intersected, overlapped, and eventually became inseparable within the structure that defined power. He had once believed that control meant division, that what existed in private could remain contained, untouched by the expectations that governed his public role, that desire, if kept discreet, would remain irrelevant to ambition. This belief no longer holds. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where personal decisions are no longer judged solely by their intent, but by how they are perceived within a broader system that depends on trust and visibility. Ambition required recognition, not only of capability, but of alignment. It demanded that every visible element surrounding a man reinforce the position he sought to maintain. Authority was not granted through title alone. It was sustained through the consistency of image, through the absence of contradiction, through the assurance that nothing existed which could be interpreted as instability. Desire did not offer this. It existed outside the structure, outside expectation, outside continuity, and because it existed outside, it began to create tension within what could no longer remain perfectly aligned. He began to understand this, not as a moral judgment, but as a structural limitation. Power could not accommodate uncertainty. It could not absorb contradiction without consequence. Even when nothing was spoken, the possibility of misalignment introduced risk, and risk, once recognized, could not be ignored. The wife remained constant, Her presence did not change in response to what had begun to circulate about her. She continued to embody the image the court recognized as legitimate, stable, composed, and aligned with expectations. She did not need to assert authority. Her consistency defined it. This consistency became the standard against which everything else was measured. And within that comparison, the difference became visible, not declared, not emphasized, simply visible. The mistress existed within that difference. Her presence did not challenge the structure openly, but it did not belong within it. She could not extend into the future he was building. She could not reinforce the alliances he depended on. She could not stabilize the perception that surrounded him. She could only exist within the present, and the present, when weighed against ambition, was not enough. The most unsettling realization was that no one needed to force this conclusion upon him. It formed gradually, through observation, through repetition, through the quiet understanding that what could not be integrated would eventually need to be removed. He did not act suddenly. There was no moment of confrontation, no visible break, no clear division between what had been and what would follow. Instead, distance began to appear in small, almost imperceptible ways. Time that had once been given freely became limited. Presence that had once been assumed became conditional. Attention that had once been immediate became delayed. Nothing ended. Everything thinned. And within that thinking, the direction of his decision became clearer. Ambition did not require him to abandon desire. It required him to prioritize, to recognize that one could not exist without consequence to the other. And once that recognition settled, the outcome began to take shape long before it was ever made visible. Desire had not weakened, yet its place within his life no longer aligned with what ambition demanded him to preserve. And as that misalignment became clearer, the balance he once maintained began to dissolve without needing to be broken. This unspoken decision was already determining what would remain and what could no longer continue. They appeared together, without deviation. No change in schedule was announced. No adjustment in the arrangement was made visible. Each ceremony unfolded as it always had. Structured, deliberate, observed by those who understood the meaning of presence within such spaces. The husband stood beside his wife, not closer than necessary, not distant enough to suggest separation, exactly where he was expected to be. And that exactness carried weight. Ritual did not allow improvisation. It required repetition. It required consistency. It required that each position, each movement, each alignment remain within a pattern that the court could recognize without question. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a public image that must be maintained with such precision that even the smallest deviation becomes noticeable. The wife did not adjust her presence. She did not emphasize proximity. She did not attempt to reclaim attention. She simply occupied her place as she always had, allowing the structure of the ceremony to define what was already understood. This made her position appear natural, not enforced, not defended. Natural. The court responded to this without needing instruction. Observation settled into expectation. Expectation reinforced perception. And perception, once stabilized, required no confirmation. The marriage appeared intact, not because it had been explained, because it had been displayed. Each ceremony repeated this display. Each appearance reaffirmed the same alignment. Each moment in which they stood together became part of a pattern that the court could rely on, and reliance created belief. The husband did not contradict this pattern. He did not resist it. He did not attempt to redefine it. He remained within it, and by remaining within it, he allowed it to shape how he was understood. This was not an act of declaration. It was an act of positioning. The mistress did not exist within this structure. There was no place assigned to her within the ceremony, no role she could occupy without disrupting the order that defined the event. She did not need to be excluded. The structure itself ensured her absence. This absence became visible, not as removal, as misalignment, where the wife stood within continuity. The mistress existed outside of it. Where the wife's presence reinforced stability, the mistress's presence could not be integrated into what was being displayed. This difference did not require explanation. It was understood through repetition. The more the husband appeared beside his wife, the more the pattern solidified. The more the pattern solidified, the less space remained for anything that could not be included within it. No accusation had been made. No decision had been announced. Yet the direction had begun to form. The most significant detail was that these appearances did not force change. They made change inevitable. By repeating what the court recognized as proper, they narrowed what could be sustained outside of it. They did not eliminate alternative possibilities. They reduced them, gradually, quietly, without interruption. The husband began to feel this reduction, not as pressure applied to him directly, as a limitation forming around him. His choices did not disappear. They became uneven. One path remained supported, reinforced, repeated. The other remained unacknowledged, unsupported, and increasingly difficult to maintain without consequence. He did not need to be told which one aligned with his position. He could see it, standing beside him, recognized by everyone present. The court did not intervene. It did not need to. The structure of the ritual did the work. It displayed what was stable. It excluded what was not. And over time, that distinction became impossible to ignore. Ritual appearances did not declare stability. Yet they repeated it until it became the only version the court recognized. And as that repetition settled into expectation, anything outside of it began to appear increasingly out of place. A presence that could not be included within that pattern was now becoming more difficult to sustain with each passing display. Loyalty did not remain where it had once been placed. It no longer existed only as a matter of feeling, nor as a private commitment exchanged between individuals. Within the court, it began to shift into something broader, something that extended beyond personal attachment and settled into a structure that could be recognized and evaluated by others. It became visible, not through declarations, but through alignment. A man's loyalty was no longer measured by what he felt, but by what he upheld. It was reflected in the order of his household, in the stability of his marriage, in the continuity he maintained without disruption. This shift did not happen suddenly. It formed gradually, shaped by repetition, reinforced by expectation, and confirmed through observation. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where loyalty is no longer understood as a private emotion, but as a public responsibility tied to reputation and long-term trust. The wife remained at the center of this redefinition. She did not claim loyalty. She embodied it. Her consistency, her composure, and her alignment with the values recognized by the court allowed her presence to function as a standard. She did not need to speak of duty. She demonstrated it. And because she demonstrated it without deviation, the meaning of loyalty began to settle around her position, not as affectionate. As a responsibility, this responsibility extended outward. It connected to family, to lineage, to the continuity that the court depended on. A marriage was not understood as a private arrangement. It was part of a larger structure that held together alliances, secured inheritance, and reinforced stability across generations. To remain loyal, therefore, was not simply to remain attached. It was to remain aligned with expectation, aligned with order, aligned with what could be recognized as proper by those who observed from the outside. The husband began to feel this shift, not through instruction. Through contrast, what had once been acceptable within private space now appeared incomplete when measured against the expectations that had begun to define loyalty in broader terms. His actions did not change immediately, but the meaning attached to them did. The mistress existed outside this redefinition. Her presence could not be extended into obligation. It could not be connected to lineage, to continuity, to the structures that the court recognized as necessary. She existed within a space that did not translate into responsibility. And because it did not translate, it began to lose weight. Not emotionally, structurally. The most significant detail was that no one declared this change directly. There was no formal statement that loyalty had been redefined. No decree that transformed its meaning. Instead, it appeared through repetition, through the way people spoke, through the examples they chose, through the patterns they reinforced. A husband who remained aligned with his household was described as stable. A family that appeared unified was described as strong. A lineage that continued without disruption was described as secure. These descriptions did not exclude alternative behaviors. They made them appear incomplete. The court did not punish disloyalty immediately. It reinterpreted it. What had once been considered a private matter became a sign of misalignment. What had once been tolerated began to appear as a risk, not only to personal reputation, but to the structure that connected individuals within the court. The husband did not face direct condemnation. He faced recalculation. Every action began to carry a different meaning. Every absence, every shift in attention, every change in pattern was understood within the new definition that had begun to settle around him. Loyalty was no longer optional. It was expected, not as feeling, as a function. The wife continued to exist within this function without effort. Her presence reinforced what the court had begun to define. She did not need to correct or challenge anything. She only needed to remain consistent, allowing the definition to stabilize through her example. And as it stabilized, it reshaped the space around her. The mistress, within this space, became increasingly difficult to place. Not because she was hidden, because she did not fit. Her presence could not be translated into responsibility, into continuity, into obligation. She remained within a category that no longer held the same meaning within the structure that now defined loyalty. This made her position uncertain, not immediately removed, but gradually reduced. The husband began to understand this reduction, not as a loss, as incompatibility. What could not align with the structure he depended on would eventually need to be separated from it. He did not need to be told this. He only needed to observe how loyalty had been redefined around him. And once that redefinition settled, the distance between what remained and what could not became clear. Loyalty did not disappear. Yet its meaning had shifted from private attachment into a visible responsibility the court could recognize and measure. And as that new definition settled, alignment began to matter more than intention. This connection, unable to be translated into that responsibility, was now becoming increasingly difficult to justify within the structure he depended on. She was not introduced as a problem. No accusation placed her in that position. No declaration named her as a source of disruption. No formal judgment defined her role within the structure of the court. Yet, over time, she began to appear as something else, not through what she did, through what she was compared against. The court did not need to identify her directly in order to understand her place. It had already begun to organize its perception around contrast. One presence aligned with stability, continuity, and restraint. Another presence existed outside of that alignment. This difference did not require explanation. It became visible through repetition. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where two individuals are never directly placed in opposition. Yet the consistency of one begins to define the instability of the other. The wife remained unchanged. Her composure, her restraint, and her alignment with expectation continued without interruption. She did not emphasize her position. She did not defend it. She simply existed within it, allowing the court to recognize what it already understood as proper. And because she remained constant, she became a reference, not declared, Understood. Everything that differed from that reference began to take on meaning. The mistress did not need to be described negatively. She needed only to exist outside of what had been established as correct. Her presence did not align with continuity. It did not reinforce structure. It did not extend into the future that the court recognized as stable. And because it did not align, it began to be interpreted, not through direct criticism, through implication, a gesture that appeared too expressive, a presence that seemed too visible in the wrong setting, a pattern that did not match what was expected. These details did not form an accusation. They formed a contrast. The court did not rush to judgment. It allowed perception to settle. The more the wife's stability was observed, the more the difference became defined. The more the difference became defined, the less neutral the mistress's presence appeared. She was no longer simply present. She was positioned against something that did not need to be stated. The most significant detail was that this positioning did not require intention. No one needed to direct it. No one needed to reinforce it. It formed naturally within a system that depended on comparison to maintain order. The husband existed between these two positions, not forced to choose, but unable to remain unaffected by the distinction that had begun to define them. His actions did not change immediately, but the meaning attached to them did. What had once been understood as personal inclination began to appear as misalignment. What had once been tolerated within private space began to feel incompatible with the structure he depended on. The mistress did not lose her place suddenly. She became less stable within it. Her presence did not disappear. It became increasingly difficult to sustain without consequence. Not because she had changed, because the court had. Its perception had shifted. Its expectations had settled. And within those expectations, her position no longer fit without creating tension. The wife did not act against her. She did not need to. Her consistency continued to define the structure that the court recognized as proper, and within that structure, contrast did the work that accusation never needed to perform. The servants carried this contrast through observation, not a thorough statement, through memory, through repetition, through the quiet way in which certain details were remembered, and others allowed to fade. The court did not exclude the mistress. It reinterpreted her. And reinterpretation, once stabilized, did not require correction. It became accepted. The husband began to understand this not as conflict, but as limitation. Not everything could exist within the same structure without consequence. Not every presence could remain once alignment became necessary. He did not need to act immediately. He only needed to recognize that the space between what was accepted and what was not had already begun to close. The mistress had not been accused. Yet her position was being defined through contrast with what the court recognized as stable and proper. And as that contrast became clearer, neutrality began to disappear from how she was perceived. Her presence, once without a clear definition, was now being shaped into something the court could no longer fully accept. No decision was announced. No gathering was called to resolve what had already begun to take shape. No authority stood forward to declare what should be accepted and what should be set aside. Yet within the court, a direction had already formed, not through command, through preference. Stability did not need to be defended. It needed only to remain visible. And it had remained visible long enough for the court to recognize it as the foundation upon which everything else depended. Continuity, order, and predictability did not draw attention to themselves. They settled quietly into expectation, and expectation became standard. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where people do not openly choose sides. Yet their behavior reveals where their trust has already been placed. The wife remained unchanged. Her presence continued to reflect the structure the court relied upon. She did not assert control. She did not demand recognition. She did not react to what had been observed around her. She remained consistent. And consistency, repeated often enough, became something the court could depend on without needing to question it. The husband did not receive instruction. No one approached him with advice. No one warned him of consequences. Yet, the environment around him had begun to respond differently. Conversations aligned more naturally with the image he was expected to maintain. Interactions reinforced the structure he stood within when he remained beside his wife. Nothing was forced. Everything was guided. The court did not reject passion. It reclassified it. What had once been tolerated as a private indulgence began to appear as a deviation from what was required for stability. Not condemned, not punished, but repositioned outside the space where authority could remain secure. This repositioning did not require agreement. It required repetition. Each appearance, each ceremony, each conversation that emphasized continuity reinforced the same understanding. Stability was not simply preferred. It was necessary. And what was necessary did not share space easily with what could disrupt it. The mistress did not disappear. She became peripheral. Her presence remained possible, but no longer central. It did not carry the same weight. It did not connect to the structure that the court continued to reinforce. She existed within a space that could not influence what the court had already begun to accept as its foundation. This change did not occur suddenly. It settled, gradually, quietly, without resistance. The husband began to feel the result of this shift, not as pressure, as direction. He did not lose his ability to choose. He lost the illusion that both choices could remain equally supported. One path aligned with expectation. The other remained outside of it. And alignment, once established, did not allow equal balance. The most significant detail was that no one needed to declare the outcome. It had already been decided through behavior, through repetition, through the quiet reinforcement of what the court chose to sustain. The wife did not win through confrontation. She did not remove what opposed her. She remained where she had always been, allowing the structure to favor what she represented. And the structure did, not because it was instructed to, because it required her position to remain stable. The court did not reject passion out of moral judgment. It set it aside out of necessity. What could not be integrated into continuity could not remain at the center of power. And once that understanding settled, everything else began to adjust around it. The husband did not need to be told which direction held his future. He could see it. Repeated, reinforced, accepted without question. The court did not declare its choice. Yet it continued to reinforce stability until it became the only path that could be sustained. And as that reinforcement settled into expectation, passion began to lose its place within the structure that defined power. That presence, once holding influence, was now quietly being moved to the edges of what the court would continue to accept. He did not end anything. No moment could be identified as a conclusion. No conversation marked a clear separation. No visible action that could be understood as a decision made and carried out. Yet the distance began. Not suddenly. Not completely. Gradually, his presence, once assumed, became conditional. Time that had once been given without calculation began to be measured. Meetings that had once occurred without hesitation began to be delayed, then shortened, then quietly replaced by obligations that could not be questioned. Nothing was refused. Everything was deferred. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where someone does not leave, yet slowly becomes absent in ways that cannot easily be confronted. The mistress did not receive an explanation. No statement defined what had changed. No acknowledgement that anything needed to be addressed. What she experienced was not rejection in form. It was a reduction in reality. Conversations became less frequent. Encounters became less certain. What had once been immediate became something that required arrangement. And then, something that could no longer be arranged at all. This change did not appear as a conflict. It appeared as a responsibility. The husband did not present his absence as a choice. He presented it as a necessity. His household required him. His position demanded him. His obligations extended beyond what could be postponed. These reasons could not be challenged. They aligned with expectations. They reinforced the image that the court had already accepted. And because they aligned, they could not be questioned without disrupting the structure that defined them. The wife did not respond to this shift. She did not acknowledge it. She did not alter her behavior in a way that would suggest awareness of what was taking place. Her presence remained consistent, reinforcing the continuity that the court had already begun to depend on. This continuity made his withdrawal appear natural, not imposed, not strategic, natural. The most significant detail was that nothing needed to be hidden. There was no scandal to conceal, no accusation to avoid, no disruption to contain. Everything occurred within the boundaries of what could be justified as proper. The court did not react. It did not need to. The pattern it had already reinforced began to complete itself. The husband appeared where he was expected to appear. He remained absent where he could afford to be absent. And over time, this distinction became stable. The mistress remained outside of this stability. Her position depended on presence. And presence, once reduced, could not sustain itself. She did not lose her place through confrontation. She lost it through absence. Not chosen, created. The servants did not speak of this change. They did not need to. They observed it. They remembered it. They allowed it to become part of the understanding that already existed within the household. Information did not need to circulate. The pattern spoke for itself. The husband did not return to what had been, not because he was forced to stop, because he had begun to prioritize differently. Ambition had not demanded a sudden decision. It had required consistency. And consistency could not exist alongside something that could not be integrated into the structure he depended on. The relationship did not collapse. It dissolved. Slowly. Without resistance. Without declaration. Without a trace that could be pointed to as the moment it ended. The mistress was not removed. She was left behind. And being left behind did not create disruption. It created silence. The court continued as it always had. Ceremonies repeated. Appearances remained. Structures held. Nothing had been broken. Yet something no longer existed. The husband did not speak of it. He did not need to. What remained visible defined what would continue, and what disappeared did so without needing to be acknowledged. The relationship did not end through confrontation, yet it was gradually reduced until nothing remained that could sustain it. And as that reduction aligned with expectation, absence began to appear as responsibility rather than choice. What had once existed without consequence had now faded into something that could no longer be recovered or restored. Nothing appeared different. The court continued to function as it always had. Ceremonies were observed. Alliances maintained. Conversations carried through halls with the same measured tone that had defined them before. No visible disruption marked what had taken place. Yet something had been restored. Not through declaration, through continuity. The household, once observed with quiet uncertainty, now returned to a form the court could recognize without hesitation. The arrangement appeared complete again. Each role is aligned with expectations. Each presence reinforced the structure that connected family, reputation, and power. This restoration did not require acknowledgement. It required repetition. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a situation where nothing is officially corrected. Yet over time, consistency re-establishes trust without needing explanation. The wife remained where she had always been, but her position no longer existed only as recognition. It had become confirmation. What had once been accepted was now reinforced. What had once been assumed was now observed with greater clarity. Her consistency, maintained without interruption, allowed her role to extend beyond presence into permanence. She did not claim authority. She accumulated it. Through time, through stability, Through the absence of deviation, the court responded to this accumulation, not openly, not directly, but through the way her position was treated as fixed, unquestioned, integrated. Her place within the structure no longer depended on defense. It had become part of the structure itself. The husband, standing within this restored alignment, no longer carried the same degree of uncertainty. The hesitation that had once surrounded him began to fade, not because it had been addressed, but because it had been absorbed into a pattern that now appeared stable. He did not regain something that had been lost. He returned to something that could be recognized. Recognition, within the court, mattered more than explanation. The most significant detail was that nothing needed to be corrected publicly. No statement redefined what had happened. No effort was made to reshape memory. What had existed before simply ceased to appear within the spaces that defined power. And in its absence, the structure closed around what remained. The mistress did not leave in a way that could be observed. She became less present, then rarely present, then no longer present at all. This absence did not attract attention, because it aligned with expectations. What could not be integrated into the structure did not remain within it. The court did not remove her. It ceased to include her. And once inclusion stopped, her presence no longer held weight. Not because she had changed, because the space around her had. Without visibility, her position dissolved. Without repetition, her presence faded. Without alignment, she could not remain connected to the system that defined influence. The servants did not speak of her disappearance. They did not need to. They adjusted to it. Memory shifted. What had once been observed became less frequently recalled. What had once been repeated became unnecessary to mention. Over time, absence became normal, and normal required no explanation. The family, now observed as stable, reinforced the values the court depended on. Its continuity extended beyond the present moment, suggesting a future that remained intact. This suggestion strengthened alliances, secured perception, and ensured that no further uncertainty needed to form around it. Stability did not create attention. It created trust. And trust, once restored, allowed the structure to continue without interruption. The wife's position extended into that future, not as a possibility, as certainty. She did not need to act to maintain it. She had already done so. Through consistency, through restraint, through alignment that had never broken. The husband no longer stood between two conditions. He stood within one, not because he had chosen publicly, because everything around him had settled into a form that allowed no alternative to remain equally supported. The court did not revisit what had taken place. It did not need to. What remained visible defined what would be remembered, and what had disappeared no longer shaped how the present was understood. The household did not declare its restoration, yet its consistency allowed the court to recognize it as stable once again. And as that stability settled into acceptance, what had once existed outside of it faded without needing to be removed. A presence that had once influenced perception was now no longer part of the space where power continued to operate. Nothing had been fought. No voices had risen. No accusations had been spoken aloud. No confrontation had taken place in any space where it could be remembered, repeated, or recorded as a moment of conflict. And yet, everything had changed. What once existed as private desire had not been destroyed, not exposed, not even directly challenged. It had simply been placed within a structure where it could no longer remain without consequence. Respectability did not act as a force. It acted as an environment. It surrounded, repeated, and reinforced until what did not align with it began to feel out of place without needing to be removed. The court did not intervene. It did not choose sides openly. It continued. Through the ceremony, through presence, through expectation, And in that continuation, it defined what would remain. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a system where no rule is ever spoken. Yet everyone understands what must be preserved in order to belong. The wife did not defeat anyone. She did not reclaim anything that had been taken. She did not assert dominance over what opposed her. She remained, and in remaining, she allowed the structure to favor what she represented: stability, continuity, recognition. These were not qualities she imposed. They were qualities she embodied long enough for them to become inseparable from her presence. The husband did not lose anything that could be named. He did not stand in defeat. He did not face removal, accusation, or exposure. Yet, something had been taken from him: the ability to sustain both. Desire had not disappeared. It had been repositioned, moved away from what could define his place within the court. What remained was not a choice made once. It was a direction maintained over time. The mistress did not fall. She did not face judgment. She did not stand before the court to be rejected or condemned. She simply ceased to exist within the spaces that gave presence meaning. And, without presence, there was nothing left to sustain. No one spoke of her. No one needed to. Absence completed what confrontation never had to begin. The servants did not recount what had happened. They adjusted to what remained. The court did not remember the process. It recognized the result, and the result aligned perfectly with what it had always required: a household intact, a lineage unbroken, a structure that could continue without disruption. The most significant detail was that nothing needed to be explained. What remained visible defined what was true. What disappeared no longer requires acknowledgement. And within that quiet resolution, the system proved its strength, not through force, through consistency, through repetition, through the ability to absorb what did not align and allow it to fade without leaving a trace that could disturb the surface. Respectability did not win through action. It won through endurance. It did not remove desire. It outlasted it. It did not silence conflict. It made conflict unnecessary. And in doing so, it ensured that nothing would ever need to be broken in order for everything to return to its place. Good evening. As this story settles into stillness, you may begin to notice how little needs to be said for everything to be understood. There were no loud endings, no clear conclusions, no moment where one side visibly overcame the other. And yet, a complete transformation unfolded quietly, shaped not by confrontation, but by what was allowed to remain and what was gently left behind. You have followed a path where power did not reveal itself through force, but through patience, where presence mattered more than argument, where the absence of noise became more influential than any declaration could have been. And perhaps, in that quiet, you have also noticed how easily structures can guide outcomes without ever appearing to do so. The court did not need to speak. It only needed to continue. And in that continuation, everything found its place. Now, as the night grows softer around you, there is no need to hold on to every detail. You can let the images drift. The long halls, the measured steps, the still expressions that never changed even as everything beneath them shifted. You can allow them to settle gently without needing to follow them further. Somewhere within that silence, the story has already reached its end. And yet, it does not feel like an ending. It feels like something returning to where it has always belonged. If you are listening in the quiet of your room, or lying down as the world outside grows distant, you might notice how still everything has become. No urgency remains. No question demands an answer. Only a steady calm, shaped by something that never needed to announce itself. You can rest here. There is nothing left to resolve. No conflict waiting to unfold. No hidden moment still to be revealed. Only the soft understanding that what continues is often what survives. And what survives, in time, becomes what is remembered. So, As you close your eyes, let that thought remain gently with you, not as something to analyze, but as something to feel, a quiet structure, a steady presence, a calm that does not need to explain itself. Thank you for staying with this story, wherever you are, whatever time it is. I hope this moment has brought you a little closer to stillness. And now, you can rest. Sleep well.